Very pleased to have joining us senior policy analyst at the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation, Olivia Enos. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. There has been now some reaction from both the U.S. and the U.K. Some might say a little late, but they have begun to implement measures against Beijing and in regards to this security law that's been imposed. Can you just lay out what you feel to be any notable sanctions or actions they have taken and whether that is going to be ultimately beneficial for residents of Hong Kong?
Yes, absolutely. We've already seen the U.S. government acting swiftly when China announced that they were introducing the national security law. Secretary Pompeo decertified Hong Kong's special status, which was a huge move and one that was required by laws that were passed by Congress last year. Since then, we've seen follow-on actions, including the sanctioning in terms of visa or travel restrictions of anonymous Chinese officials for the role that they played in undermining Hong Kong's autonomy. We've also seen other efforts, not just from the executive branch, but also from Congress to respond swiftly, including by introducing several different bills, some of which would grant particular refugee status or safe haven to Hong Kongers, and others that would look at even further financial sanctions measures. And of course, there are already tools that exist through the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to levy sanctions against individuals that are financial in nature under Global Magnitsky or under those Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act authorities. But we've also seen, as you mentioned, the UK, as well as Taiwan stepping up, saying we will offer safe haven to Hong Kongers. In the UK case, to 3 million people who already have some semblance of British citizenship, and then Taiwan basically saying, hey, we're willing to be here. And I think those types of activities should be rewarded, and the U.S. should galvanize on that attention and energy, hopefully to build a coalition of the willing to support the Hong Kong people.
Yeah, coalition of the willing sometimes can be termed a loaded term if people remember the whole saga of decades past with the George W. Bush administration. But I think if you don't live in the U.S. or are not a resident of North America, you can sometimes be mistaken, believe that whole continent is a monolith, and you think of Canada basically just, well, they're just there and they kind of follow along. But there's a little bit of a discrepancy here, and I wonder if you can help us understand, because there seems to be an issue with Canada not necessarily being clear on how they stand. Obviously, they do not necessarily appreciate the security law, but they're not clear on how willing they would be to accept a refugee should they be fleeing Hong Kong and seek safe harbor within Canada. Can you explain the dynamics in why perhaps Trudeau and his government feel a little bit more sensitive about the topic?
Well, I think countries all across the globe are, trying to play the best hand that they possibly can so that they can kind of have their cake and eat it too when it comes to condemning China for human rights violations. And this is certainly not limited to the context of Hong Kong. It also has to do with other issues as well.
Right.
Because people also want to still be able to engage economically with China. And I think that those two don't necessarily have to be at odds with each other. I think that, it's perfectly acceptable to call out a country when they're acting in inappropriate ways. It's surprising to me that Canada has not yet extended refugee status, since Canada is usually like one of the first countries to extend those types of priorities. But, Canada is far from, the only country to step up. We also saw today Australia, or perhaps it was yesterday, Australia actually stepping up and already adjusting its policy in response to Beijing's really just awful actions in Hong Kong, including by suspending the extradition, policies that they had with Hong Kong, as well as adjusting their export controls. And I think that you're going to start seeing those types of moves from other countries around the globe. And it's been interesting to see how forward-leaning Australia has been on many fronts, calling for investigations into China for some of its ways that it mishandled the response to COVID-19. And of course, facing retaliation from Beijing for that. But I think it's interesting to see who exactly is stepping up and calling Hong Kong out, and calling Beijing out for what they've done in Hong Kong. But also, equally interesting are the countries that are not stepping up. Most of the ones that aren't are the ones that receive a lot of Belt and Road Initiative aid, like countries in Africa and elsewhere. So we got to watch for that, too, because that's pretty malign influence on the part of Beijing.
Yeah, and so it's this interesting proxy diplomatic sort of chess game going on right now between Washington and the UK on one side, maybe we can say, and China, and what they are kind of using to kind of push around their economic weight, especially with perhaps economically more vulnerable countries that would have a more outsized influence from China should they threaten economic retaliation, right?
That's absolutely right. And I mean, it's concerning to see China not only influencing countries' behaviors and responses to their, very, very much so violating policies toward Hong Kong, but also if you look at how those countries that receive aid from China, or a disproportionate amount of aid from China, and their voting records at the UN, we see that they're often doing Beijing's thing, which is very concerning.
Let's talk about the role of social media, because you know better than most that social media has become sort of a boogeyman in U.S. politics. And a lot of people may be considering these various platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Google, WhatsApp, especially Facebook, and maybe as sort of the bad guys in a lot of situations in terms of the political discourse in domestic politics. But these platforms have stated they will deny government law enforcement requests for users' data if it violates the rights of the users. Seems to imply in terms of the security law being applied and maybe some kind of requests for certain individuals and what they may have been communicating on these various platforms. Again, just like all these other countries that are sensitive to economic influence, these are platforms that want to have a presence in this deemed to be very lucrative Chinese market. Is social media something that could be used as a tool to stifle human rights?
Well, we've seen Beijing in their own internal context, certainly using social media as a means to track down individuals and to quash political dissent. We saw this even in the way that they responded to COVID-19 by shutting down Dr. Li Wenliang, who was the whistleblower for COVID-19, and they called him in for questioning for sending a private message to other doctors in the WeChat context. And now what we're seeing is that Beijing is using this new national security law to extend its own laws extraterritorially. So that means that if you or I, being outside of China, were to post something on social media, say Twitter or Facebook, and you happen to be passing through Hong Kong, let's say on a layover, you could actually be apprehended at the airport and then putting into custody, called in for questioning, et cetera, at the behest of Beijing. This is very, very, very concerning because, and I think that countries like the U.S. and others need to condemn it unequivocally because it's a huge violation of sovereignty, it's a huge violation of individual liberty, and it's an extension of China's laws in an extraterritorial manner that's very, very worrisome. So I think that the social media outlets have a opportunity to play a positive role here, certainly by safeguarding the data of private citizens, but also by continuing to promote freedom of speech on its own platforms.